Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. There is a bus stop at Mount Vernon that I'm told is haunted. For non-Singapore residents, Mount Vernon is a road between two cemeteries, a Christian one on one side and a Muslim one on the other. Why do I say it's haunted? Well, I've been in many taxis, and when the drivers are talkative, they will most likely tell you this story when you ask them about ghostly encounters. They say if you travel through Mount Vernon Road between midnight and 4 a.m., if you're lucky, you will see a beautiful young Malay mother with a baby in her arms. One time, there was an ignorant taxi driver who happened to pick her up. She boarded the taxi and just pointed ahead without saying a word, so the driver drove on. After a few minutes, he asked her where she wanted to go. She just smiled and instructed him with a hand gesture to go straight ahead. Mount Vernon is a long, stretched-out road, and as the taxi approached the end of it at the junction, he asked her again where exactly she wanted to go. She simply replied, "De la Rumo." Going home. He was a little annoyed by her ambiguous reply and made his impatience felt with his next remark. He complained, "Yes, I know you want to go home, but where the heck is your home? Gosh, you're giving me a hard time." She looked hurt and started sobbing. Feeling guilty, he apologized and then asked her again, nicely this time, what her address was. She then asked to be taken back to the place where he had picked her up. The irate driver, now furious, made an angry, sharp U-turn and headed back to the spot where he had picked her up. Too busy nagging, he failed to realize that she was no longer seated in the back seat. When he did look in the mirror, he was horrified to find she was gone. Then he smelled a sweet scent of frangipani flowers, a flower often associated with death. Chilled to the bone with fear, he sped out of Mount Vernon Road all the way home. Other taxi drivers have also picked up the mother with her child, but they had different experiences with her. Some would realize immediately after she boarded that she was a ghost. Some would not even notice anything strange until they smelled the sweet scent. The taxi driver from the story never traveled along Mount Vernon Road after midnight again, not after that experience. This story happened before I was born, and it was told to me by my father, who was a taxi driver. It was around 9 p.m. My father was driving his taxi to meet my two uncles, who are also taxi drivers, at Rex Selegie Chicken Rice Store, for dinner. While driving along the old Bukit Timah Road near the railway station, his taxi was flagged down by a beautiful, slim Chinese lady. He stopped and asked her where she was headed. She told him, Bidadari Cemetery on Alginate Road. Without hesitation, he agreed to pick her up. To him, she was just a passenger, and it wasn't far out of his way. Once she was in the cab, my dad noticed his taxi suddenly felt heavier. Her perfume was overpowering, even with all the windows down, which was strange since this was back when taxis didn't have air conditioning. My dad kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, and she noticed. Breaking the silence, she explained why she was visiting the cemetery at such a late hour. She told my dad that her husband was a heavy drinker and a gambler. Every night, he would go with his gambling buddies to a hut near the cemetery to avoid the police. My dad asked her if she wasn't afraid to go there alone, but she replied confidently, "I go alone but will come back with my husband, so I need not worry." She even mentioned her financial struggles and that she worked as a lounge hostess to pay off her husband's gambling debts. During the conversation, she asked my dad to wait for her while she fetched her husband so he could take them back to Bukit Timah. My dad agreed but mentioned he couldn't wait long, as he had to meet his brothers for dinner. She told him that if he couldn't take them all the way, he could drop them off at Serangoon Road to catch another taxi. They eventually reached Bidadari Cemetery. She directed him to the exact spot, and he had to use his high beams, as it was pitch dark. After she got out, the car returned to its normal weight with a jolt. Before leaving, she asked him to wait and reminded him to keep the meter running since finding another taxi at that hour would be difficult. My dad reversed the car to get into a comfortable waiting position and unknowingly dozed off. Suddenly, he felt a hard pat on his shoulder. Thinking it was the couple, he opened his eyes, only to find the meter showing more than $25. He looked around, but the lady was nowhere in sight. He checked the time, and it was 11:45 p.m. Feeling chills down his spine, he started the car and turned on his high beams. To his horror, the taxi was parked on the road, facing the tombstones of the Malay cemetery. In the rearview mirror, he saw the same lady, now dressed in all white and staring directly at him with a stern expression. Out of fear, my dad hit the accelerator and drove straight home. He was drenched in sweat, as if he'd been caught in a heavy downpour. For over 2 weeks, he was severely ill. My mother had to take him to mediums, temples, and offer daily prayers. The lady kept appearing in his dreams, haunting him and depriving him of sleep. He lost his appetite and became weaker by the day. After consulting with Chinese and Malay mediums, my mother was advised to pray to the spirit and ask her to leave my dad alone. It took over 2 months of offerings and prayers for my dad to return to his normal self. From that incident until his passing 9 years ago, he never drove a taxi at night again. He only worked from 6 a.m. until 3 p.m. Upon checking at the Bidadari Muslim cemetery, my parents learned about a young Chinese woman who had fallen in love with a Malay man. He had no stable job, was involved in drugs, and eventually became a pimp. When she realized she was pregnant, she hoped he would settle down, but he accused her of infidelity and denied the baby was his. Heartbroken, she hanged herself in the cemetery hut. Since then, men in the area have reported feeling her presence. Some claim to hear her crying, forever mourning the life she lost. Built around 150 years ago, Makrichi Reservoir is the oldest reservoir in Singapore. Before it was built, the area was a very scenic hill. And who could have guessed that there is an eerie tomb, once a romantic alcove, that most people now shun away from? It was a lookout point protruding from the middle of a hiking track along the slope of a hill. The view from there was spectacular, overlooking a lush hilly landscape like a flowery meadow across the valley. Birds and wild monkeys in the hills created a natural orchestra, and the sounds of nature filled the air. This romantic alcove was a meeting place for Fan and Locke, not their real names. The alcove witnessed the most dramatic emotions of life and death, joy, romance, betrayal, grief, and tragedy, displayed by this couple. The story happened near the end of the 18th century. Fan was the only daughter of a rich and prominent family who ran an import trading business with the British. She grew up in Britain and always loved nature, which shaped her into a bold and open-minded person, somewhat opposite to her father, who was very traditional and strict. He was a typical Chinese businessman, calculating gain and loss above all else. Since Fan was young, her family had arranged a marriage for her, common in those days, to the son of a tycoon named Tai. This marriage would benefit Fan's family business greatly. However, Fan never wanted to submit to her fate. At 20, she felt capable enough to manage her own life. She often left home to find peace on the scenic walks of what is now Makrichi Reservoir. It wasn't a reservoir in those days, but a perfect place for some quiet moments away from troubles. Fan met her Mr. Right there one day. His name was Locke. We don't know much about him, not even from our informant, but he was said to be a charismatic communist, a leader of some political group before the war who regularly organized gatherings near the Makrichi Reservoir area. It was fate that brought them together. They clicked and fell in love, despite coming from vastly different backgrounds. Their dates at Makrichi Reservoir continued for some time. They met there, fell in love, and vowed to marry with nature as their witness. They courted each other more frequently. Then one day, Fan's family caught wind of this. As expected, Fan's father was furious. Not only was his daughter disobeying him, but Locke was also a communist leader, a natural enemy to a pro-British businessman. Fan's father and Ty's father devised a plan to patch up the situation, determined that Locke wouldn't interfere with the arranged marriage, which was only a few months away. One fateful evening, Fan went to meet Locke at their favorite spot. Instead of Locke, one of his friends arrived and handed her a letter. Nobody knows the contents of the letter or who actually wrote it. However, the next morning, Fan's body was found dead at the bottom of the valley where she always went. No one knows if she jumped, was pushed, or fell by accident. After Fan's death, the wedding was, of course, cancelled, and Fan's family business, without the help of Tycoon Ty, quickly declined and eventually went bankrupt. Nevertheless, Ty's son, who had reportedly loved Fan, spared no expense to bury her in a beautiful tomb at the lookout point, overlooking the hills across the valley. Years later, Macritchie Reservoir was developed into a water catchment area, and the valley turned into the reservoir we know today, flooding even the lower part of the tomb. This is how it became known as the Water Tomb. How do I know this story? I have a friend related to Ty's family, who says Ty's family had intervened in Fan's relationship with Locke, but never intended her harm. Most people thought Ty truly loved Fan and built her an extravagant tomb out of love. The truth, however, was darker. Locke was murdered in the same year Fan died, and doctors discovered Fan had been pregnant. People thought Locke had died in a riot, but it was a plot. Ty's family arranged for him to be buried in Hill Cemetery, on the opposite side of the hill from Fan's resting place, so that they would be buried back to back, forever separated by the hill. This bitterness turned into a haunting. Fan's grave became known as the Water Tomb, and people reported sightings of a female apparition emerging from the water at night. Some call her Shui Gui, the water ghost. Ty's family, feeling guilty, has tried for years to appease Fan's spirit. They invite monks to perform rituals, but it hasn't helped. They continue to maintain the tomb and bring offerings, especially during the Qingming festival and Hungry Ghost Month. It's said that the family may be cursed. Both Ty's grandfather and father drowned, although not in Macritchie Reservoir. Ty's father, in his later years, developed mental problems and was usually kept at home. But one day, he mysteriously slipped away and was found drowned in a sewage drain. His death was ruled unnatural, and it made the news some years back. I'll share a secret with you. If you want to know if Fan's spirit is around, just throw a coconut into the water. If it floats, there's no spirit. But if it sinks, Fan's spirit is there. This incident happened not only once, but twice during my short visits to the memorial park. I didn't understand what got into me that I kept wanting to visit the memorial. I guess it was influenced by watching the movie Saving Private Ryan too much. The first time I went to the memorial, from a distance, I saw a policeman waiting by the gates. It was almost 6 p.m. We Muslims believe that this is not a good time to visit cemeteries, but I went anyway. I went there alone, with only my ego and so-called bravery as my companions. I knew it was curiosity that got the best of me. However, as I entered the gates, there was not a single person to be found. The memorial was very quiet. And trust me, it is a very peaceful place. A gentle breeze blew across my face, and for a moment I thought I liked it there. So I walked around and looked at each tombstone. Just knowing that they had died young made me shed a tear. Nothing happened, of course, and I really quite liked being alone. Then it happened. As I was in the Muslim graveyard section, I swore there was a lady following me from behind. But she wasn't anything scary of that sort. From the corner of my eye, she looked just like any other visitor to the memorial. I thought some people had come, so I didn't react or say anything. But as I turned around to look at her, I realized there was no one there, and that I was still very much alone. That was when I knew my stay was overdue, and I had to leave. I started to feel very uneasy, so before I left, I decided to sit on one of the marble benches near the memorial slabs for a while. This time, I could have sworn I felt an unearthly presence standing beside me, and my hair stood on end. I started to feel a little edgy. Yet again, I wouldn't move. It happened again. There was a loud thud sound coming from behind the memorial slab, like someone had stepped on a metal switch cover. The sound was so loud that I turned around to see what it was, but there was no one there. I thought it was probably the sound of nearby construction work, but who was I kidding? There wasn't any construction going on. And this time, it happened much louder, thud. That was when I was sure it came from behind me and from inside the cemetery. My face turned white. All of a sudden, there was a voice telling me to leave that very instant, and so, with only my 2 legs, I walked out as fast as I could, not even turning around to see who could have been behind me. When I walked out the gate, I still felt fear as I prayed to God that I would get out of there safely. As I almost reached the bus stop, I turned around for one last look, and to my disbelief, I saw a very tall Caucasian priest looking at me. He was so tall that he was almost as tall as the gate itself. He had blonde hair and was wearing a blue robe with a yellow sash around his neck. Shocked, I looked again, and he was gone. There was neither the priest nor any man I had seen loitering around that memorial park earlier. When I reached home, I was in such a state of shock that it took me days to recover. My father is a butcher. He goes to the market early in the morning every day to prepare the pork for sale. As he doesn't ride a bike, he walks all the way from our house in Mount Erskine to the nearby market. He often takes a shortcut through the cemetery, which gets him there in a shorter time. All the while, nothing unusual had ever happened, except on 2 occasions. Both incidents happened on the morning of Chinese New Year's Eve while my father was walking alone through the cemetery. The first time was 3 years ago. It was still very early, probably around 5:30 a.m., when he left the house. The morning was exceptionally cold, as it had rained the night before. As my father was approaching the cemetery, he saw a pile of stones in front of him. From that pile of stones, he saw blazing lights, and soon a shadowy figure emerged and flew into the air. He just ignored what he saw and sped past the cemetery to get to work. Another incident occurred exactly a year later. Although it was quite similar, this time the figure appeared clearer and therefore scarier. As my father was walking along the same path that cuts through the cemetery, he saw a flash of lights ahead. The flash of lights came toward him and went past my father. As it passed him, he saw a man moving along with it. However, the man had no legs. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.